Hello everyone, welcome to the second lesson of Intro to Java. So our first topic is going to be for loops and while loops. For loops and while loops both have similar functions, but there are different ways to create this for loop and while loop. For example, here in the for loop, we have a starting value of the loop, which we call the counter. We set int I equal to 0. This is called an instance variable, and it will be stored in the thread stack area. Then we have an increment of the count. So every time Java loops through, it will increment the count. And then we have an ending value of the loop. If I does not meet the condition of being less than or equal to 10, we will exit out of the loop. So here you can see that all three conditions are met. We have an increment, we have established our variable, and we have a condition. Similarly, let's move on to the while loop. We have a starting value of the loop, which we initialize outside of the braces. Now you can see in your for loop, we have 3 statements inside of the braces, while in the while loop, we only have 1. We always only keep the condition in the while loop, while in the for loop, we have all 3 segments inside the braces. In the while loop, we only have 1 segment inside the braces, which is the condition. The starting value of the loop is kept outside, and there is one thing that you may have noticed that there was an error of. We have not yet incremented the value. This means that it will continue in this loop forever, since I will always be equal to 0 and I is always less than or equal to 10. To make sure that we exit out of this loop at some point in time, it's important that we increment the I somewhere inside this loop. Now let's talk about what happens. What happens in Java when we create a new loop and what happens inside the thread. So first of all, we create a new variable, then we evaluate the new variable, then we have the loop, and then it's incremented. So first, what Java is going to do, it's going to see, alright, there's a new variable here, so I'm going to go create it in the thread stack area. Then I'm going to check, is 0 less than or equal to 10? True, I'm going to go inside the loop, complete step number 3, and then go to step number 4, and I'm going to increment it. Then I'm going to go back to step 2. Is it still less than or equal to 10? Great. Come back and continue this process of 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4 until 2 comes out to be false and we exit out of the loop. Now we're going to create an exercise where we're going to be creating a for loop and a while loop. Now let's head on over to the Eclipse IDE. Hi guys, okay, so now we are in the Eclipse IDE, so we're going to make sure that we are out of the main method, and we are going to create we're just going to create a method for the purpose of this for loop. So since we do not know how to create a method yet, just please type along with what I'm typing. Alright, so as you can see here, I've created a sample method, and inside the method we're going to start our for loop. So as mentioned before, the for loop has 3 parts. The first part is initializing our instance variable. In this case I have I equal to 0, you can set any variable equal to 0. Next, I want to set a condition. So I'm going to say I want it to be less than 8. Then I want to increment it. I can increment it by 2, I can increment it by 3, by 4, but for now I'm just going to increment it by 1. Now inside my for loop I want to have some sort of conditions that I want to be run through. So I'm going to say that I want to print every time the value of I. So what am I going to do? I'm going to print the value of I. Now this is a simple for loop with 3 conditions, and inside the for loop we have something that we want to be done. Alright guys, now that we have created our for loop, let's create a while loop. Now I'm going to have a separate method for my for loop here and a separate one for my while loop. So I've commented them out so it's easier to understand my code. So I'm going to create a method. Since we don't know how to do that, as mentioned before, just please follow along with what I'm typing. Alright, now that we have created our method, we are going to type in our while loop. So first of all, in our while loop, as mentioned before, we should have declared our instance variable. I'm going to set my variable of type integer equal to 0. Then, as mentioned before, our while loop only has one statement, which is our condition. Now, I'm just going to have it to be the same thing as my for loop, so I'm going to set it less than 8, and inside I want it to print my j index. Now here we need to make sure it's j, my bad. And now we have the same for the for loop and the while loop, so you can see which one you would prefer. Normally we use a for loop when we know that we want to end at a certain point. But in a while loop, when we just want to continue until something is false but we don't know how many times we should be going through, we use a while loop. Now that we have covered for loops and while loops, let's talk about methods. Methods are just a block of code that performs a certain function or does a certain job. Now here you can see we have the public int calculate sum method. This calculate sum method takes two numbers as their parameter. The parameter is the values inside the parentheses. So it takes two parameters, and one integer and a second integer, and it sums them and it returns the sum. So if this return type here is not void, you're going to have to return a certain value. Now since the sum is an int, we will not get a syntax error because an int is being returned. Now you can see this method has a job. The job is calculating the sum of two numbers. Objects are made up of many of these methods that do different jobs. Now the different parts of a method. Now these are important before, as we mentioned, for terminology purposes. A method header is this part, the public int calculate sum, and the method body is everything inside the parentheses. Remember, as I mentioned before about the constructor, the method header can be different, meaning the name will be the same of the constructor, but it can have a different number of parameters. That is what I mean when I say method header can be different. Now, exercise number 4, we are going to be creating a method. Let's head on over to our Eclipse IDE. Hi guys, welcome back to the Eclipse IDE. So you guys are going to still be working in the same Hello World class. So in order to create a method, we looked at the slides and there were two parts, a method header and a method body. So the first thing we want to be aware of is what type access modifier we want the method to be. As we mentioned before, there were three kinds of access modifiers that we had. We had public, we had private, and we had protected. If you forgot the definition of these, please go back to the video. You can look up the definitions from there. But for now, we're just going to stick with public, so anybody who accesses our method can use them. So our first step is public. Next, we want to address the return type. The return type can be a primitive type or an object type. Since we have not learned object type, we're just going to stick with primitive types. Primitive types can be doubles, integers, characters, strings, or boolean. For now, let's do double. So our return type is going to be double. And it can also be, the return type can also be void. That is if we don't want to return anything. We want just our method to run as normal, but we don't want it to return anything to the user. But for this case, we do. So we're going to have double. Next, we want a method name. For your method name, you want to make sure that it accurately describes your method. Like in the previous case, when I showed you the method of calculate sum, it was the accurate name because it was calculating the sum of two numbers. Similarly here, let's click multiply numbers. This is the name of our method because this is going to be the function of our method. Inside our method, we're going to have two parameters. The parameters are something that the user passes as information to the method so it can perform its job. So we want the user to give his or her first number as first num. So this is going to be the first number that the user passes. It's going to be of type double, so the user will pass a decimal. The second number will also be a double, which we will call second num. Now that we have two numbers from the user, we're going to multiply these numbers. So we're going to create a variable called mult. We're just going to call it mult. Now this mult is going to multiply the two numbers and store the result. So we're going to do first num times second num. Now that it has multiplied, we are still getting an error. Now you must be wondering, why am I still getting an error? If you hover over the method name, it says that this method must return a result of type double. It is Java's warning us that we have not returned any value yet, and we need to return a double type. So we're just going to return whatever we had multiplied over here, which is mult. Now, let's give an example of when this wouldn't work. If I had set this to int, you would give an error. I'm supposed to return a double type, but mult is of integer type. So we need to make sure that this is double type. We will go into more specifications of the syntax and why you can't store an int when two doubles are multiplied in the future. But for now, let's just keep in mind that we should have the correct return type, we should have the correct access modifier, and a name representing what the method will do. Let's head on over back to the slides. So before I mentioned the word thread. Thread is the name for the Java execution path. This means that when you have code written, how do you know which order Java processes your code? This is the job of the Java execution path, or what we call thread for short. It will execute your methods and it will access your fields in different ways. So now we want to learn that way in order for us to correctly write our code. Our thread will always start with the main method in the object. So you will see that we had this method in our original Hello World class that we had created. The method will always come through the thread will always come through here first, and then it will continue on with the rest of the code. To execute any method, the thread must go through the parentheses. So the thread will come through here, through this arrow, and continue into the rest of the block. Now this is some just basic concept. As we move further into the different aspects of Java, I will teach you more about what happens behind the scenes with the Java execution path. Now let's talk about object creation. I have talked to you that objects are instances of classes. But how do we create this instance of a class? If we have a given code, how do we create an object out of the template that we have? The main is the new operator. The new operator calls one of the class's constructor methods. Now this is where the constructor method comes in. The constructor method is one of the most vital parts in creating an object. Basically, what is going to happen is the new operator here is going to be called the object A and the parentheses. This is the method. This is the constructor method that is created. When you call new object A reference is created of the new object, and it will be stored in this object variable type. I will go into more about what reference is and what happens when the object is created. For now, all you need to know is that an object is created when the constructor method is called and the new operator is used. As you can see here, new is one of Java's keywords because it is this purple magenta shade. Now let's talk about accessing an object. So you may have noticed that you may live around in a neighborhood where every house has an address. This address is a certain street name, a certain zip code, a certain postal code, a state, etc. Objects also have addresses. But objects have addresses in the form of hexadecimal. So instead of zip codes and street names, the address is in form of a hexadecimal. A hexadecimal is this you see down here. It's a system of different numbers and letters combined to form something called the hexadecimal language. The object address that we have is called the reference. And this reference is given after the new operator is called. So if we go back to the previous slide, we see that when we create this new object, a reference of that object is sitting there. There is a new object created and there is an address to that object and it's sitting right here. And we want to make sure that we store this address in a variable in case we later want to access the object. So we are going to store it in this variable called object. And you might see here this object A. Now you might be wondering what object A is. Object A is the type of the variable. Now when I mentioned before that there were two types of variables, primitive type and object type, this is an object type because the reference that is coming in out of the new method that is created is of object type. We created a new object called object A, and object A is of type object A. So we want to make sure that we store the variable in the correct type. Since the object is not a primitive type, it's not a double, it's not an integer, it's not a boolean, it's not a character, it's not a string, it's an object, it's a separate type. We want to store it correctly. So it is not a primitive type, it is an object type. This is a hard concept to grasp, so if you still have not understood, please feel free to schedule a Zoom session or ask any questions that you may have, and we will be willing to answer them for you. Now, as mentioned before, we always want to store the reference or the address of the object, because instead of memorizing this reference in case we want to access the object later on, instead of memorizing the address, we should store it in a variable that we can easily call later on. Now let's talk about garbage collection. I mentioned before that there was CPU and then there was RAM, and how Java rents a portion of RAM to hold all of the code and program in that memory space. Now, you may know that eventually that memory is going to fill up, and that is not such a good thing when we are continuing to create programs. This is where our dear friend garbage collection comes in. This garbage collector looks for objects that don't have an address that is stored. For example, as we went back here, we have this new object. If we didn't store this new object in this variable object, then this object would not have a reference that is stored. It would just be roaming around empty, and it would not have an address that people know about. This is where the garbage collector comes in and says, well, object, since you don't have a reference anywhere, I'm going to have to clean you up and put you away and clear up this memory space that you are hogging. So the garbage collection runs in the background of your computer and looks for any objects that don't have a stored reference. This is where the term garbage comes in, and garbage is objects that do not have an address stored. As you can see here, this object A does not have a reference. This reference was not stored when the new operator was called, so it doesn't have a reference. So then you can see that the garbage collector would come and pick it up. As you can see here, a new object A was created, but it wasn't stored anywhere. So Java is giving a warning that, hey, you should probably store it, otherwise the garbage collector is going to come and clean it up. Now, the garbage collector helps free up any memory that may be unnecessary so we can store our new programs. Now let's talk about long distance assignment. I know that we are almost there through the lesson, so let's first talk about long distance assignment. Long distance assignment is, let's say, when I call a method called findMax. This method has 3 parameters. So when I call the method, I'm going to input 3 values that I want to be stored. And I want to store the value that I get from findMax, which will be an integer, into maximum. What is going to happen is the value 1 is going to equal to 34, value 2 is going to equal 63, and value 3 is equal to 49. Since we have 3 variables here and 3 numbers that are coming in through the parameter, this is called long distance assignment. As we mentioned before, a variable has an assignment operator along with an equal sign and the value. Since this does not have an equal sign, like value 1 equal to 34, instead it has the method called and the parameters passed. This is called long distance assignment instead of normal assignment. Now this is just a concept that you should be aware of when you call methods. Now let's talk about a compounded assignment operator. Now you might have seen me use this before, but if you haven't, I will explain it to you now. An arithmetic operation such as addition, multiplication, division, and subtraction can be compounded. Now this has nothing to do with the efficiency of a program, it's just easier to type and more efficient for the programmer. Instead of writing num of erasers equals num of erasers plus 5, let's say I had 20 erasers originally, and I have 5 more now. I bought 5 from the Dollar Tree. Now I have 25 erasers. Instead of writing num of erasers is equal to the previous num of erasers I had, which was 20, and an additional 5, I can just do num of erasers plus equals 5. These two have the exact same meaning, but this one you can see here is a lot more efficient and pleasing to look at. We have finished our lesson 1, and this is what we learned today. We learned objects and classes and the difference between objects and classes. We set up our workspace. I told you the difference between CPU, RAM, and their functions. We talked about heap space and thread stack area. We talked about common Java conventions, variables, static versus non-static will be covered next time, basic keywords, for and while loop, constructor methods, Java thread, garbage collection, long distance assignment, and compounded assignment operator. Thank you guys for listening to the first lesson of cheat code. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send the questions through the form. I hope to see you guys next time. Thank you. Here are some optional exercises you guys can do to supplement the topics that we've learned. So for number 2 specifically, if you guys want to check that your method here called for loop has worked, in your public static void main method inside your class, please write this code. This code will call the method you have created. Code piece right here will go back up here and execute this block. So if you want to make sure your code is running, you guys can use this statement. But if you don't want to do so, that is fine also. If you have any other questions on the instructions, or if you don't understand how to do these exercises, please feel free to contact us. Thank you.